Hello and welcome to our confirmation class. I'm speaking right to the camera because the very first couple of minutes of our confirmation class, we found out the camera wasn't rolling, and there was a suggestion, you'll see it on the video, to record the first part of it again for later. So here we are. And we'll get started right away. For catechism, I love to start at the very beginning with the most basic thing of all, and that is the story of Jesus. Jesus' death and resurrection is at the very center of what we believe. And to put it in its most simple terms, there was this guy, and he said he was God. And he said to prove that he was God, they were going to kill him on a cross. And on the third day, he was going to rise from the dead. They killed him on the cross. And on the third day, he did rise from the dead. He might be right about that God thing. From there, we are able to see that resurrection and go, oh, that's an important moment in history. That tells us something. That gives us an anchor to hold on to say, well, if he's God, what else did he say? Well, he said that the Old Testament was all about him. Well, maybe we should read that Old Testament and see what it says about him. The eyewitnesses that were with him said something about him. Maybe we should listen to what those eyewitnesses had to say. Those eyewitnesses were so convinced of his resurrection that when they were threatened with death, they still confessed that Jesus rose from the dead. The resurrection, we don't believe the resurrection because the Bible says so. We believe the resurrection because all the evidence we have in history says so. And from there, I think we'll pick up with the confirmation class as we gave it last night. And we'll see you in just a sec.
Yeah, but
we will just continue from where we were and pretend that everybody heard that.
You can add it to the recording later.
I can certainly try. So the disciples are threatened with agonizing death. If somebody came up to me and said, the sky is green, and I go, no, it's pretty blue, and they threaten me and say, we're going to cut you to pieces, we're going to kill you painfully unless you say that sky is green, I would be sorely tempted to say that sky is green. However, some things are worth standing up for whether they threaten you or not. The resurrection of Jesus changes everything. Because death is the scariest thing our world knows. Death is the worst thing that can happen to you. It is the fear of death that causes people to not do stupid things, usually. When resurrection is on the table, that changes everything. So this is the story we've been handed down. We've been handed it down by, we have 4 eyewitness accounts of Jesus' life: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. People want to say, well, if you ignore Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, you don't have any evidence of the resurrection of Jesus. That's not entirely true. Because something happened in history. Secular scholars have got to figure out, where did this church thing come from? well, these 12 guys, secular scholars will say, these 12 guys made it up. How? They're fishermen. These aren't educated people. These aren't the great orators of the day. These aren't even people who know how to teach somebody anything. And these guys go out and create the world's biggest religion that survives persecution after persecution. When we start taking all the evidence of history and lining it up with what we know about the church, the disciples, about Jesus, not believing in the resurrection takes more faith than believing in the resurrection. But a lot of people want to dismiss that, don't want to think about it, because when you think about it, well, that's some guy 2,000 years ago saying he was God and then rising from the dead to prove it means something for us. Because that God points backwards in history and says, I've been all the way back there. And he points forward in history to us, past us, to the very last day and says, I'm there. And even more than that, we just talked about the very basics of the story. We didn't even get to the part where he said, I did it for you. Jesus is born, lives, dies, and rises for you. And that's what we're going to be covering the entire time we do this class. It is all about Jesus. And we break it up into all kinds of different ways. We've got 10 Commandments and Apostles' Creed and Lord's Prayer and baptism and Lord's Supper and confession and absolution. But it always comes back to the story of Jesus. If you were kids in my confirmation class, hey, I might do this anyway. I have an assignment for you all.
Oh no.
It's not a hard one.
My dog ate my homework.
The center of the story of Christianity is the death and resurrection of Jesus. What I have my kids do and what I'm going to have you do is open, or not to, yeah, I'll have you do it tonight when you get home. But I would like everybody, every night this week, up until next Monday, reading Matthew chapter 26, 27, 28. That's the death and resurrection of Jesus. All the way from his anointed at Bethany to betrayed by Judas, crucified, buried, risen, and meets his disciples in Galilee.
And what chapters was that?
26, 27, 28. Last three chapters in Matthew. You might read it through the first time and go, okay, I remember some of this. But by going over it again once each night for a week, that story is going to be even more familiar to you. That story is going to become part of your heart. Not to say it isn't already, but it is to reinforce the very center of our faith, the death and resurrection of Jesus. Because that's important. Everything that we believe and study and do as a church is centered on that. Now, we're also going to be doing a few other things. We will be looking at all kinds of different passages and all kinds of different places. So, another basic thing to probably set up for you guys is a timeline. I go through this spiel a lot with like Proverbs class, but our Western minds think on timelines. Our language is based on a timeline. What are our tenses? Past, present, future. Everything we say fits onto a timeline. And so our brains are wired to think on that, to think in that way. Now, if you ask somebody, if you ask somebody from the Middle East or somebody from the Far East, or somebody from Jesus's day in Jerusalem, they will not think in this way, because in Hebrew, the tenses are not past, present, and future. They are perfect and imperfect, which means a completed action or an incompleted action, and it has nothing to do with time. That's probably a rabbit trail for another day, but just to kind of wrap up on it, when God is said to do something in the Old Testament, it's always in the perfect tense, even when it hasn't been done yet. Because if God says he's going to do it, you can count on it being done. And if somebody unreliable says, I have done this thing, it might not be in the perfect tense. So you have to, that's kind of hard for us to wrap our brains around. So we're going to make sure we can wrap our brains around everything that we're going to bring up. So a timeline of the history is not a bad thing.
Is that why they say when you pray as if it's already done?
You can do that. Wish me luck, I am using chalk while wearing black.
How wise.
So we've got Adam and Eve at the very beginning of our timeline. We will be going over some of the things that they went through as we get into the commandments and get into the Apostles' Creed. So then we end up with, next in history, we end up with Noah. Noah had a pretty big event happen. God decided to prefigure baptism and to save 8 people through water. The rest of them is not so happy, but Noah is saved. And what happens there is going to be important. Abraham and the patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph. This is going to be the guy that God comes to and says, hey, you. Who, me? Yes, you. You're going to be the guy that I'm going to fulfill all my promises through. Promises I made to Adam and Eve, the promises I made to Noah. You're going to be the one through whom they come. All right. So does that mean I get a son? Eventually.
But eventually is a long ways off.
So what happens with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob is going to come up a lot too. Then comes Moses and the Exodus out of Israel. This is a pretty big event. In fact, it is the event that tells the story for the people of God all the way up until Jesus. It is the story that they become part of. I'll get up more on that in just a bit. So Moses leads them out. They get to the promised land, and then we have the era of the judges. The judges, Israel gets into a cycle of deciding to do whatever they want, and God gives them the consequences of doing that. They return to God. God sends a Savior. Repeat, repeat, repeat. Eventually, the last judge is Samuel, and the people tell Samuel, hey, we want a king. And Samuel goes to God and says, God, they rejected me. And God says, no, Samuel, they didn't reject you. They rejected me. And I'm going to give them a king.
And they're gonna regret it.
So, even though the very first king is King Saul, we mark the era of kings with the best king, King David. Now, best king is subjective. It's not a high bar. We go through all the various kings. Israel ends up splitting up into two kingdoms, the northern and the southern kingdom. Northern kingdom gets defeated by Assyria and scattered. The southern kingdom eventually is conquered by Babylon. The Babylonian exile is an enormous moment in the history of the people of God. This is when they have to figure out, okay, God has made promises, but because we did not keep his word, we are here. So the question at the time was, what happens if God shows up where he promised to be, Jerusalem, and we're not there?
Oops.
Now, fortunately, God does not do this. But this is what they wrestled with. They come out, going into the Babylonian exile, faith was a real problem for the people of Israel. Coming out of Babylon, their faith was strong. So when they return, they get the temple rebuilt, and unfortunately, they are no longer able to have their own king. Cyrus, king of Persia, rules over them, and then when Persia is conquered by the Medes rule over them, and then the Greeks rule over them, and then finally the Romans rule over them, and we get to Jesus.
Wasn't there a king in power when Jesus was born? That's where the wise men went.
So, what the Romans did is say, okay, we're ruling over you, but you guys need somebody of your own people to kind of be a representative who you'll listen to. Unfortunately, that person was Herod, and Herod wasn't exactly Jewish. So, nobody liked Herod.
What race was he?
I don't remember. I don't remember what he was. He was. If I guess, I don't even know if I would be right. I might even be wrong on what I said. So we get to here and we go, all right, we've got a timeline of everything in the Bible. But Christianity doesn't stop with Jesus. I'm going to come up here because otherwise I'm going to run out of chalkboard. We get the early church. For the first 300 years of the church, roughly, the church was heavily persecuted, either by Jews or by Romans or by the local the locals in the area who were like, "What are you doing?" It all changed in 313 AD when, after 300 years of pagan emperors, they finally get a Christian emperor, Constantine. I say Christian, he's Christian enough to not persecute them. But then he declares the entire Roman Empire to be Christian because he is Christian. That means everybody who's been persecuting Christians for the last 3 centuries, that's alive, now has to show up at church and say, "Hi, I'm here to be baptized." And the church goes, "Oh my goodness, what do we do?" This is...
Because they don't have the structure to handle it?
No. They've been a persecuted church all this time. Everything they have is geared towards standing up for the faith. And all of a sudden, they no longer have to stand up for the faith because the law has come behind them and said, everybody here is going to worship. And what do you do?
There was no transition?
No transition.
Wow.
Now, emperors did this on a regular basis. One emperor may say, "Okay, I'm the god, you all worship me." Another one will say, "Zeus is the god, you worship him." "Oh, we forgot about the god Roma, that Rome is named after. We better..." And so every time a new emperor showed up, people are used to saying, "Okay, what god are we worshiping today?" "It's Jesus." "Oh, really? Okay."
Who's that?
So all of a sudden you had this whole big influx of people who are just there, which was really weird.
Is this during the time that the usual mode of worship was within people's homes? Or underground? Or
Yeah,
wherever
it was.
they
Yeah,
had to go?
it was underground. There weren't church buildings. It was mainly people's homes. And all of a sudden, okay, we're going to start building church buildings. Okay, you're the emperor. Of course, the next emperor decided that Christianity wasn't worth following, and it took another couple of emperors later for this to kind of really set. But in the meantime, the church being recognized meant that they could finally they could actually go out and communicate with each other and go from church to church and go, "Okay, which writings do you have copies of? Which parts of the Bible do you have?" Because some churches may only have the letter to Corinthians. Some churches might only have Matthew's Gospel. And so everybody got together and said, "Okay, let's collect all of these." They already knew what was around. It's just, are we missing anything? Are these actually written by apostles, or are they written later?
Well, is Paul part of this timeline? Or he
Paul
just
is
part of
very
the
early
early-
in this time.
in the
Paul,
early church?
yeah, Paul's at the very beginning. Paul's at about 40 to 50 AD.
So he's in the persecution period.
Yeah, he's in the persecution period. And then all of a sudden there's peace. And the people in Constantinople can now talk to the people in Rome, can now talk to the people in Jerusalem and coordinate, and what are all we doing here?
And now you've got the books that were written by the apostles, and you've got the books that we end up calling the Apocrypha, and books that we don't even know about anymore.
So, yeah, there was a lot of figuring out to do, but by about 400, we finally started kind of getting things down, and then you have people like Augustine and who are able to be theologian philosophers. So about 400 to, let's actually push that all the way to 1500, Middle Ages. Secular philosophers like to call it the Dark Ages. Problem was that they weren't very dark. There was actually a lot of intellectual thought going on. It's just that the world was Christian. Now, this has its advantages and it has its drawbacks. Everybody in Europe was Christian. Nobody knew what that meant. We show up on Sunday and something happens because not everybody spoke Latin. The further you get away from the 400s and the closer you get to the 1500s, the less Latin is known. So you come to church and you hear them doing the Lord's Supper in Latin. This is my body. Hoc est, let's see. Hoc est coram Deo. This is the body of God. Hoc est coram Deo. And they hear hoc est and they say, well, the priest is up there doing his hocus pocus. Which is where we get the term from. He's turning the bread into the body of Jesus. I don't know how it works. I don't even know why.
Is that intended to be ridiculed, or is that explanation?
It was the language they used to express what they saw,
Okay.
but had no idea what it actually
Didn't really
was.
have understanding.
Yeah, and so
That's how languages change over years.
so
You get those kind of words developing.
So through all of this, you have some very faithful people, and you have some people who are there just because if I don't show up on Sunday, the village is going to think I'm not a Christian.
Well, if we're all the way into the 1500s, aren't we seeing the development of the modern church?
That's the Reformation. Reformation is 1517. Reformation. And the Reformation is probably the part that many of us know well because it gets preached every Reformation Sunday. Martin Luther shows up, nails the 95 Theses at the door of the Wittenberg Church because there's some guy running around selling the forgiveness of sins. And Luther, as an Augustinian monk, says, forgiveness of sins can't be that easy. It's got to be a whole lot harder than that. And so he writes all these 95 Theses up to say the Pope would be aghast at what you're doing. Turns out the Pope liked the money. And when they accused Luther, Luther decided to do a little bit more studying on the subject and went, oh, it's not that the forgiveness of sins is too cheap, it's that it's still too expensive because it's free. So the Reformation comes along.
It's not that it's free, it's just that it's not,
It's
doesn't cost
done.
us.
Yeah, it's done for you.
Yeah, it's already done.
But along with the Reformation comes the Renaissance. And the rise of humanism, which is the idea that if people work hard enough and think hard enough, we can solve every problem. It is also called modernism. So if you've heard the term postmodernism, this is what it is post. The Renaissance came with the idea that everything had a solution if you just worked hard enough at it.
Well, that's like scientific theory and the whole thing
Yeah,
is
so
developing there.
so science is gathering as much information as it can. Christianity is actually at the forefront of scientific research. And so Isaac Newton, Christian. Names are falling out of my head, but
Da Vinci, Copernicus,
yeah.
yada, yada, yada.
So now there's the famous case of Galileo, who said that we've got a heliocentric, I think he might have said heliocentric universe instead of a geocentric universe. And there were some people in the Roman Catholic Church who said, you're a heretic. And problem was that you had the problem was that the people who were calling him a heretic were trying to protect their power rather than actually, do theology. Because the church at this point had become an enormous center of power and attracted people who were not exactly Christian.
And they had the center of the money that could make things
Yep.
happen too.
Yep. So money and power ends up being a problem. Turns out it's been a problem for a long time. But as things continue, we end up getting.
It's power.
Yeah.
I'm sorry?
It's still a problem.
Yeah.
So we end up getting into theologically speaking, the 1800s, where we get pietism and rationalism. Pietism is the idea that your faith is shown by your good works. Now, there's a way in which that is true. James will, the book of James puts it this way. You say that you have faith without works. Well, I'll show you my faith by my works. Pietism turned the equation the other way around, though, and said, it's only by works that you have faith. That's backwards. Rationalism took the idea of modernism and brought it further and said, we can explain everything, and if there's something in the Bible that we can't explain, well, maybe it didn't actually happen. Jesus rose from the dead. We can't explain that. Well, maybe it didn't happen. That's a problem. So pietism and rationalism started creeping into the church.
People died rather than recant their faith. We can't explain that, so maybe it didn't happen.
This is...
Thousands of people died rather than recant their faith.
Mhm.
How do we explain that?
So this is where modernism ends up going. Modernism looks to human beings to solve all problems.
We're well into the time of the Crusades too, right?
Oh yeah,
So
the Crusades are going to be up here.
So we had religion going against
Yeah,
the infidels or the other guys.
Yeah,
and
certainly.
us coming back with their money.
Yeah. So the ideas of money and power end up becoming a problem all over the place. Because and it starts with Constantine making the church the religion of the empire. Because now, where do all the funds to build new buildings go? The church. Not that it's bad to build buildings, but people get a hold of money. Well, we thought we were on the cusp of solving all the world's problems by human reasoning. In fact, in Europe, alliances had been made all over the place in such a way that someone would have to be colossally stupid to start a war, because it would bring everybody in. And nobody wants that. And then Archduke Ferdinand was shot. And what started? The war to end all war. and it was ugly.
But before that, 1800s to 1900s, we had all kinds of little
Oh yeah.
area.
Oh,
I'm on
yeah.
this side, then I'm on this side, and we're with you, and then we're with you. So it kind of was a practice for World War One.
Oh yeah. So I'm painting in big strokes right now. World War One happens, and it's the war to end all wars. Germany loses. They have to pay reparations to half of Europe. They're bankrupt, and in that bankruptcy, a very loud little man comes to power and starts World War II. And World War II is the moment that the philosophers of the world said, maybe we can't solve all our problems. Postmodernism. And that's where we are today. Postmodernism is the idea that there is no one solution to all the world's problems. Therefore, everybody comes up with their own. Sounds really familiar.
Is that why everybody was doing their own atomic bombs?
So, yeah, one of the reasons. The philosophy does take a while or the world takes a while to catch up with philosophy. After World War One, Nietzsche was a very popular philosopher, but it took 40 years for what he taught to really kind of sink in. And it was nihilism, that nothing matters. And the only thing that really does matter is how you feel. And you should get what's yours while you can, because nobody else will get it for you. This is where Karl Marx's ideas start coming, being taken more seriously. In fact, World War One is kind of the trigger for Russia to fall and Lenin to take over. And following Marx, he goes, well, okay, we've only got two groups of people. We've got the oppressed and the oppressors. We're going to side with the oppressed because they're morally right.
Yeah. And they killed off all the royal people.
They killed off everyone who challenged their power. So it starts with one reason, and it sounds sort of moral, and then it's discarded when it's no longer necessary
Or useful.
But postmodernism starts really flowing out of this and coming into the world's consciousness, and so even if we went out on the street today, if I asked somebody out there, what does Nietzsche have to say about this? What does Marx have to say about this? They won't have a clue. But you tell them what they said and they go, yes, I agree with that. Because it's the life that they've been trained for, the life that they're living. Christianity has an answer for that. It's not that we can solve our own problems. It's not that we do what is right in our own eyes and let our own truth be the only truth we look at. We have someone outside of us who is true. We've got Jesus. We've got the death and resurrection. That death has been conquered. Our sins have been forgiven. And that's a really world-changing idea.
So we come full circle.
Yeah. Turns out that our timeline isn't necessarily a straight line.
Circle.
It just kind of keeps on doing this.
Everything old is new again.
Yeah. In fact, the church is probably between Jesus and the early church at the moment. We're starting to see signs of possible persecution. We're not there yet, but we're seeing signs that it could be there.
You hear a whole lot more name calling.
Yeah. So having that timeline is going to help us when I say, oh, hey, let's talk about Abraham. Now we can kind of put him where he's at. Oh, well, let's talk about pietism. Now we can kind of put that, have an idea of where that is. Because this is history, but there's a word in history that's really important. It's the word story. Exodus chapter 13. This is a hymnal. I'm not going to find it in there.
It would be really a blessing if you could.
Exodus chapter 13, verse 8. The 10th plague in Egypt. So we're here with Moses. 10th plague in Egypt just happened. People are getting ready to leave, and they've instituted the Passover, and God says, okay, you guys are going to remember the Feast of Unleavened Bread. And he gives up the Lord tells Moses what to say. Moses starts telling the people, and then he says this: "You shall tell your son on that day, it is because of what the Lord did for me when I came out of Egypt. And it shall be to you a sign on your hand and as a memorial between your eyes, that the law of the Lord may be in your mouth. For with a strong hand the Lord has brought you out of Egypt. You shall therefore keep this statute at its appointed time from year to year." So every time the Father would come to the Son on the day of unleavened bread and say, "This is the day we left Egypt." They were to say this when they got into the promised land. How many of the people who left Egypt made it into the promised land? 2. Caleb and Joshua. Or did only Caleb and Joshua said, "The Lord brought me out of Egypt"? No.
They were in the sperm and ovum of their parents when it was done.
And they would say this for generation after generation after generation.
They were still, they were there in that elemental
The
form.
Exodus story is their story.
Mm-hmm.
They were there. Even if they weren't there physically, they were there. This is who they are. We do the same thing. The Exodus story is your story. You are there. Why? Because Jesus is there. The death and resurrection of Jesus, what I'm going to have you read every day for a week. It is your story. You guys are part of it. And that helps tell you who you are. You are God's child. You are the one for whom Christ died. That's pretty epic. And that's something the world doesn't really have. The world doesn't have... the world wants to disconnect you from all of your stories. Oh, you weren't there. You weren't part of this. This doesn't belong to you. You don't have anything. Well, God wants to make sure you have a story. And it is the story of Jesus. So as we
That
go,
really is our family roots. I mean,
Mhm.
people are so into the genealogy and
Mhm.
trying to find out where they come from.
and
That's part of where we come from.
that story of, so we get we can also get that from our families. I can tell you stories of my family. They won't be your stories, but they will be my stories. Even if I hadn't been born yet, it would be my stories. But God brings us into a story that is for all of us and connects all of us and makes us his church, makes us his family. That's pretty awesome.